Okay, so chapter 2. Um, where was I? Okay. Chapter 2, Linguistics and Grammatology, returns to Derrida's present moment after sort of the backtracking he does in chapter 1, and takes up the work of Saussure, though he repeatedly sort of situates Saussure's work in the 20 centuries of history he very quickly surveys in chapter 1. Why Saussure? Because Saussure's terminology and his contributions to the study of language, right, the distinction between signifier and signified is the structure of a sign, um, the notion of identity not as the essence of something, but rather as its difference from other things, the arbitrary relation between words and meanings, right? Um, that all of these contributions were so influential to a cross-disciplinary movement that we call structuralism that was prevalent in literary studies, anthropology, history, and psychoanalysis, at least in France and later in the United States. In this chapter, and not just the US, like, I don't mean to be ethnocentric in this account anyway. Anyway, in this chapter, we first see Derrida as a reader. And he's a weird one, right? He's a weird reader. He does not read Saussure in order to disagree with him in the ways we've become accustomed or we become used to in personal or political disputes and disagreements. He does not oppose Saussure's positions as if the two of them were in a kind of duel, or as if they were exchanging jabs concerning their evidence or their oversights or their respective faulty conceptions of the way things are. Up to Derrida in the history of philosophy, we might ask ourselves, how have philosophers settled disputes? Right? How have they traditionally settled disputes? And what you find, if you look at a bookshelf in a philosophy section in a bookstore, is that they invent entirely new conceptual schema. Right? That's what's so interesting about reading philosophers, right? And that these schema are fresh with dense, difficult to understand terminology, all of which they oppose or offer as revisions to previous or prior systems and terms. Though Derrida is certainly difficult, though he certainly invents his own terms, though he certainly seems to be unfolding his own system, he does something quite a bit different than that. For Saussure, Derrida shows, writing is for Saussure, writing is a mere accessory to language. Therefore, one need not incorporate it into a theory of science or language. It is outside language proper. Much the same way we might think that musical notation, to borrow a useful analogy that one of you mentioned in a presentation, is exterior to our experience of listening to music, or exterior to, just a second, exterior to music as a composition of sounds or tones, right? Instead of disagreeing with Saussure that writing is exterior in this way, Derrida radicalizes this position. On page 100, not 100, on page 314 of the Grammatology, Derrida writes, quote, "As Saussure will do, Rousseau wishes at once to maintain the exteriority of the system of writing and the maleficent efficiency with which one singles out its symptoms on the body of language." But am I saying anything else? This is very near the end of the book, but am I saying anything else other than this? This is Derrida writing, asking of himself. Yes, he claims, inasmuch as I show the interiority of exteriority, which amounts to annulling the ethical qualification, and to thinking, writing, beyond good and evil. Interiority of exteriority, beyond good and evil. What do these phrases mean? Let's read a section of chapter 2 together. It comes early in the chapter, page 34, but anticipates Derrida's moves later as he develops his notions of trace, difference, and originary synthesis. The paragraph begins, sorry, blinding you. The sun's coming through the window here. Hopefully it doesn't make this video unwatchable. So page 34. Okay. The paragraph begins writing would thus have the exteriority, but let's sort of move up just a little bit. What is Derrida doing here, right? To offer some context, let's read the sentences leading up to this paragraph. So above that, skip the first sentence of the paragraph above that. Why else would Saussure give so much attention to that external phenomenon, that exiled figuration, that outside, that double, meaning writing, right? Writing, which is the double, the outside, the figure of speech. Why does he judge writing impossible, quote, to disregard? What is nevertheless designated as the abstract with respect to the inside of language? Writing, and he's quoting Saussure here, though unrelated to its inner system, speech or language proper, is used continually to represent language. We cannot simply disregard it. We must be acquainted with its usefulness, shortcomings, and dangers. End quote. End quote. In short, Derrida is asking here, why does Saussure pay attention to that which shouldn't matter? Okay. So let's read the next paragraph. Writing would thus have the exteriority that one attributes to utensils, to what is even an imperfect tool and a dangerous, almost maleficent technique. One understands better why, instead of treating this exterior figuration as an appendix, or marginally, Saussure devotes so laborious a chapter to it, almost at the beginning of the course, his primary work, which was compiled from the lecture notes of his students. It is less a question of outlining than of protecting, and even of restoring the internal system that is speech as language proper, of the language in the purity of its concept, against the gravest, most perfidious, most permanent contamination, which has not ceased to menace, even to corrupt that system, in the course of what Derrida strongly wishes, in spite of all opposition, to consider as an external history, as a series of accidents affecting the language and befalling it from without at the moment of, quote unquote, notation, as if writing began and ended with notation. We'll keep reading. Already in the Phaedrus, Plato says that the evil of writing comes from without. So this is really important. Derrida is establishing a direct connection between ancient philosophy and modern science here. Okay. The contamination by writing, the fact or the threat of it, are denounced in the accents of the moralist or preacher by the linguist from Geneva. The tone counts. It is as if, at the moment when the modern science of the logos would come into its autonomy and its scientificity in Saussurian linguistics, it became necessary, again, just as in Plato, to attack a heresy. Let's pause there. The tone matters, Derrida claims. That though we seem to be reading the work of a modern scientist, a Genevan scientist, that nevertheless what keeps creeping into this work of Saussure is the tone of the moralist, of the preacher, right, in the words of the linguist from Geneva. What this statement, that the tone matters, what this statement indicates is that Derrida is not primarily interested in clarifying Saussure's intentions. He's invested, rather, in connecting a particular methodological oddity with a historically resilient moralism. A Platonic moralism about things outside, marginal, auxiliary, and how these outside things, infiltrate the pure, ideal, good, a moralism alive and well in this particular region of modern science. All right, so let's keep reading. This tone, this moral tone, began to make itself heard when, at the moment of already tying the episteme and the logos within the same possibility. The Phaedrus, Plato's Phaedrus, denounced writing as the intrusion of an artful technique, a forced entry of a totally original sort, an archetypal violence. There's violence again. Eruption of the outside in the inside, breaching into the interiority of the soul, the living self-presence of the soul within the true logos, the help that speech lends to itself. Thus incensed, in other words, just like Plato is, Saussure's vehement argumentation aims at more than a theoretical error, more than a moral fault. He aims at a sort of stain, and primarily at a sin. Sin has been defined often as the inversion of the natural relationship between the soul and the body through passion. Saussure here points at the inversion of the natural relationship between speech and writing. It is not a simple analogy. Writing, the letter, the sensible inscription, the tattoo, has always been considered by Western tradition as the body and matter external to the spirit, to breath, to speech, and to the logos. And the problem of the soul is no doubt derived from the problem of writing, from which it seems conversely to borrow its metaphors. What has Derrida done in these sentences? Right? He's laid the groundwork for the difficult pages to come on difference, difference, trace, originary synthesis, spacing, and the hinge. And the lure, too. Difference for Derrida is not just the name of a contrast between two things, right? I have blue eyes, you have green eyes, right? It's not simply that. Rather, like writing in Saussure's system, it is an exteriority at the heart of every interiority, the difference that is always already circulating in every purportedly self-coherent identity. The writing that is already there, already haunting Saussure's theory of language, no matter how much he struggles to get rid of it. Différance, with an A, Derrida's neologism, names a twofold radical process of consciousness formation, species formation, thought formation, identity formation, history formation, language formation, experience formation, life formation, or simply, as Derrida puts it on page 63, and you can go there to look, différance as the formation of any form, of just form in itself. So what are the two steps of this twofold radical process of formation? The first is the production of difference. In the Saussurean sense, right? The production of difference in the Saussurean sense of an identity or a name or a convention or a meaning that other identities, names, other than other identities, names, or conventions, of something I can point to and say, there it is, a presence, but that I can point to and say, there it is, a presence, only because it's already within a much larger system of classifications, within a language, as it were, within a fabric. So that's the first thing, right? The production of difference, right? The production of something that is in itself only something because it's different than other things, okay? Production of difference. And two, the deferment of that difference, the deferment of that presence, of that meaning, of that identity, which is, after all, only thinkable, only apprehensible, not through any sort of stable essence, but because of the fabric or chain of difference in which it is already caught. As Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak puts it in her daunting preface, I want you to turn back to pages 9 to 10. So let's go here, pages 9 or 10. Right, she says, in the last paragraph in Roman numeral page, not 9, actually 11, sorry, XI, the preface, the paragraph that begins, the preface is a necessary gesture of homage and parricide. Forget about that for a second, right? Skip a few sentences forward. Humankind's common desire, she writes, is for a stable center, and for the assurance of mastery, the knowing or possessing. And a book, with its ponderable shape and its beginning, middle, and end, stands to satisfy that desire. But what sovereign subject is the origin of the book? I was not one man only, says Proust's narrator, but the steady advance hour after hour of an army in close formation, in which there appeared, according to the moment, impassioned men, indifferent men, jealous men, in a composite mass. These elements may, one by one, without our noticing it, be replaced by others, which others again eliminate or reinforce, until in the end a change has been brought about, which it would be impossible to conceive if we were simply a single person. End quote. What then, she asks, is a book's identity? Ferdinand de Saussure had remarked that the same phoneme, pronounced twice or by two different people, is not identical with itself. This is Saussure, she's saying, not Derrida. Its only identity is in its difference from all other phonemes, meaning all other sound images. So do the two readings of the same book, she asks, show an identity that can, she doesn't ask, she states, so do the two readings of the same book show an identity that can only be defined as a difference. The book is not repeatable in its identity. Each reading of the book produces a simulacrum of an original, that is itself the mark of the shifting and unstable subject that Proust describes, using and being used by a language that is also shifting and unstable. Any preface, and Spivak is talking about her own preface to this book, commemorates that difference in identity by inserting itself between two readings. In our case, my reading, my rereading, my rearrangement of the text, her translation of the text, and your reading of it. Okay, so I think what she's saying there about the identity of a book, that a book can only have an identity because of the way in which it is always constantly differently read, that it is always different from itself, right? That it has identity only insofar as its identity is always deferred by several other readings, right? This itself is also an illustration of this two-step process that Derrida is describing in difference and using Saussure in order to develop, right? Okay, so the trace corresponds to both of these movements in difference. On the one hand, it is Derrida's new name for a sign as a structure of reference, the only thing one has to refer or represent a thing's difference or a thing's presence. It is also the name of those tracks to elsewhere, the pathways within a presence to something other than it, the exteriorities which are interior or are interior. The trace is the alterity at the origin of the same, right? So on the one hand, the trace is all we have in order to try to make fully present to ourselves something in the world, but it is also at the same time the very component within any structure of reference that makes it impossible for that thing to gather itself up into a presence, difference, and deferment. The trace guarantees that there are no simple origins in a universe of difference, only synthetic, composite, complex, and complicit ones. Okay, so that's chapter 2. All right, in the next video, I'll be moving on to chapter 3.